Okay, good morning, everyone. Or I guess it's afternoon now. It kind of snuck up on me. Thank you so much for joining us for today's free webinar, Pitch Perfect, Preparing to Pitch and Win with Brian Rutberg from 3C Communications. My name is Erica Malsberg, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Early Growth Financial Services, and I'm going to be your moderator today. This presentation is probably going to run about 50 minutes or so. If you have questions as we go along, please feel free to just jump right in with them. Don't bother raising your hand. Just enter them right into that chat field. Or you can also tweet them to us at Early Growth FS with the hashtag Startup Pitch. We're going to try and answer the questions as they come, or we'll wait until the end and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A at the end that we can take any remaining questions. If we do happen to run out of time before we answer all of your questions, you can follow up via Twitter, or also we'll be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow that's going to have a link to this recording of the session as well as the deck, and Brian's email address will be there as well as at the end of this presentation. So you're welcome to follow up with him directly with any outstanding questions that you have. Before I hand it off to Brian, just a quick few words about Early Growth for those of you who don't know us. We're an outsourced financial services firm that provides day-to-day accounting, CFO, tax, and valuation services and support for small to mid-sized companies. We currently have a footprint in 9 markets from Silicon Valley to New York City, and we support 10 to 15% of all the venture-backed companies in the US with an impressive client list that includes companies such as TechShop, Indiegogo, Zendesk, Clout, RocketSpace, OpenERP, and over 500 plus more companies nationwide. Okay, enough about us. You came to learn how to pitch, not to hear about us. So this is 3Com Communications show here, and you're going to learn a little bit more about what they do in a moment. But just to kick it off, I want to do a quick introduction to 3Com Communications principal Brian Rutberg, who we're so pleased to have with us today. Brian's a lifelong communicator and relationship builder who's worked with companies from startups to Fortune 50 and not-for-profits to improve customer, partner, employee, and investor relations. He helps clients find their messages and key supporting evidence and aligns teams with their key audiences through strategic messaging consulting, executive coaching and training for frontline staff, and targeted marketing and communications execution. So besides being a little bit self-conscious about how I'm coming across to a presentation expert, we are very thrilled to have you here with us today, Brian, and appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. So good afternoon and welcome.
And good afternoon, and thank you. And you did beautifully, but you knew you would.
Thank you.
Hello, all. Yeah, hello, greetings, and good afternoon to all. Thank you, Erica, and to all who are on the line. I'm very glad that you've chosen to join us today. I am unbelievably passionate about the capability of good communications to make a difference for businesses, for not-for-profits, and for people. And the opportunity to work with you all and to work with my friends at Early Growth is just great. I will say, in terms of working, that I am working from home today. So if you hear barking, it just means the mail has been delivered. I've got my family members have promised to all be nice and quiet, but the dogs, I can't quite extract the same request. So let's dive in. I like when I'm in front of an audience in person to model good audience alignment. And so I'd love to be able to ask those of you on the line a couple of questions about who you are and what you've come here to see and hear today and what it is you're trying to learn. But the best I can do on a webinar is to tell you a little bit about the organizations I work with and see if you can kind of fit yourself in there. But I work with organizations like those on the left who are in true startup mode. They're building out their minimum viable product, they're starting to determine interest, and they may already have dozens or even hundreds or thousands of free or freemium customers and some number of paid customers. They're funding via Bootstrap and their friends and family so far, and now they're looking to expand by going to the market, the angel investors and the venture capital type investors, and they are getting ready to enter pitch competitions as well as to do one-to-one pitches. A little further along, they're modest-sized companies. They are growing and they have done well for themselves, and now they're starting to look for the opportunity to expand, not just finish off their product, but to really find a bigger market and have the funds to grow bigger. And then I've worked with companies like those in the seeking acquisition column, which needed someone to come in and work with them on a variety of point communications areas in order to position themselves for acquisition. In the case of both Aperture, which got acquired by IMS, and NetOptics, which was acquired by networking company Ixia, both of them had successful liquidity events for their owners not long after we worked together. I am not trying to suggest causation, but there was at least perhaps some correlation. And then I also work with companies over on the right who are the kinds of companies that are well established and, of course, are acquirers of other organizations. So I've had the view from both sides. I hope you fit into one of those categories. It seems pretty inclusive. Here's a bit about me. As Erica said, everything I've done in my career has benefited from my being a communicator and a relationship builder. I've sold to end users. I've sold through channels. I've done field marketing and product marketing. I spent 20 years in big businesses at places like Hewlett-Packard, McKinsey and Company, and Microsoft. And through all of those roles, I was regularly speaking in public on behalf of my product or my group, or I was doing pitches about sales opportunities or collaboration opportunities. And in my last few years in big corporate at Microsoft, I ran their executive briefing center, worked with a lot of folks who had stories to tell about their products, but may have thought that their idea of doing a successful presentation was making it through all 60 slides in the 60 minutes allotted. And it was really in finding myself there and working with folks on bringing their 60-slide deck, but getting to the right 3 or 4 or 5, and really engaging with the audience and making it a conversation, not a presentation, that I found my stride. And about 4 years ago, I stepped out of Microsoft and joined a small consulting firm. And at this moment in time, as you'll see at the end of the deck, I am in the process of moving out of having built a successful communications practice in a small consulting firm to developing my own and launching my own communications firm, which is 3C Communications. More on that as we get to the end. But let's dive into why you're here. Here's the 3 things we're going to do today, and I welcome your questions through it all. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the difference between pitching a company versus pitching a product or service. We'll go into some detail about building a pitch deck and what needs to go into a deck that you can take into a pitch competition or into a meeting with an angel or venture capital investor. And then we'll talk about the actual public speaking and presentation materials aspect of it all. I like to call it owning the room, making sure that when you're up there, they are paying attention to you and you are getting your message across in the most impactful way that drives the audience to emotion and action. So let's begin with this conversation about pitching your product versus pitching your company. And depending upon what stage you're at, and depending upon what kind of an organization you are, I mean, you've already got your story built for pitching your product or service at end users. If you've done it smart, you've probably got great stories to tell, and you've been part of this movement toward the buzzword of storytelling over the last several years. And of course, you've also got features and benefits that you have to promote depending upon the audience that you're pitching. When you're pitching your company and you're looking for investment at a pitch competition or with angels or VCs, you're really selling your audience on the fact that you can get to the end users. You have to be able to defend your product, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that, but mostly you're convincing them that the market is there and you can reach it and you'll have a compelling offering when you get to them. With the product or service, it's all about now. It's present benefit oriented. With a company, when you're pitching to potential sources of funding, it's about what they can get later, what it will be. You're selling the future of your company. You are, to some degree, selling pie in the sky, and your job is to be convincing that they can actually reach that pie in the sky. It's future benefit oriented. And the single product or service that you need right now is what you focus on when you're pitching a product. But with the company, you're really selling the capabilities of the whole organization, the portfolio, if you will, of products and services that you can collectively deliver basically everything you offer. For investors, you want to be looking for someone who can be not just a source of funding, but who can be an accelerant to your growth, thanks to the wisdom that they bring, the experience that they bring, the connections that they bring, the fact that they've seen companies like yours go through this before. And by convincing them that your value goes beyond the fact that you've built a better mousetrap, as it were, you start to get to the conversation that will be of greatest interest to you, which is, in addition to the cash on the barrelhead, what else can you bring to my company? And when I work with organizations on developing their pitch deck and their pitch story, we're always talking about how do you make sure that you don't just attract an investor, but you attract the right investor. So that gives you some idea of where the differences lie between product and service versus pitching the company, and the different mindsets you've got to go in and how future-oriented you need to be. Let's talk a little bit about the pitch deck itself. From my perspective, you've got one job when you are pitching at a pitch competition or to a live potential investor, and that is to remove doubt. Right? Experienced angels and VCs who might be in the audience at a pitch competition, they've seen it all. You have to stand out, and you have to address this mental scale they've got between risk and reward. Any startup company, no matter how smart you are, no matter how good your team, no matter how great your product or how sustainable your competitive advantage, is a risk. You've got to make clear that you've mitigated the risk, and you've got to make clear that the upside reward is well worth their investment. A little more on that. People talk about three kinds of risk, and the pitch that you make, the deck that you build, and the talk track that goes with it should address these three types of risk. There's market risk, which is another way of saying, is the market actually real? Does it care about the solution you're bringing to market, be it product or service? And is it growing? Or are you just addressing a very narrow slice? Or you haven't validated that it exists, you haven't done any testing, you haven't done any surveying. Prove to me, your audience should be saying that this market truly exists. With product risk, it's what you'd expect. Can you actually build it? Can you align your dreams to reality through the tough job of whatever it's going to take, manufacturing, getting the supply chain right, sourcing if you're manufacturing, or can you have enough bodies to deliver your service at scale? And will you be able to keep up with the times? And then there's execution risk, which is, again, reaching scale. Can you add and retain customers profitably? Not just can you find them, but can you find them and make a profit off it? And can you keep them hanging around and expanding their use of whatever it is you've got on the market? And can you sustain any competitive advantage that you may have at the start? So address market risk, address product risks, address execution risk, and suddenly you've got your audience pricking up their ears and paying attention, particularly if you've built the right deck to do that job, and if you've got the right talk track that drives emotion and keeps them interested throughout. So we go on to actually building that deck. You'll see I've sourced down at the bottom, so you can, when you get the deck, just follow those links, and you'll get an idea of how different folks talk about the stuff that needs to go into a deck. You'll notice on this slide that there are the two different versions of what needs to go into a pitch deck, and they're not exactly the same. What they are is close enough that you've got a rough idea. So I'm trying to say there's no particular script to this, but there is a really good general outline. There's certain things that any investor is going to want to see, and you can draw lines between the group of 14 on the left and the group of a dozen on the right to show, oh yes, let's see, there's the big idea. That's roughly the equivalent of your logo and mission and positioning and the problem that we solved. Number 4, solution on the left. Number 3, solution on the right. So, not good to be too prescriptive, but you get the idea that there's certain things any investor should want to see. The problem statement, I like to think about, what's the problem that you solve, for whom you solve it, and the reasons why your target customer or users are frustrated with current solutions. Business model and how you make money, absolutely, absolutely critical. And of course, how you sustain that market opportunity line of how much money could you make if you turn into the dominator in your target market. Naturally, you want to get into the competition, who they are, and why you've got their number. And I won't bother reading through the whole slide. A, I hate that. It's not best practice. And B, you can read along for yourselves. But these are the kinds of things you want to make sure as you build out a pitch deck that you follow one or the other of these rough scripts to make sure that you do hit all the right points when you're in front of a pitch competition. Many pitch competitions will actually give you a rubric and tell you, we want to see the following 5 or 10 or 15 things. I spent some time with a friend of mine here in the Seattle startup market talking about what he's looking for when he's in the audience of a pitch competition. A gentleman named John Seacrest, he runs the Seattle Angel Conference. He is the co-owner, co-founder of a local accelerator hub. He spends his time all day, every day, working with companies at various stages of their growth, trying to make sure that they can find money and that they are delivering the best pitches. What he values are these things. He talks about where is the evidence that the market cares? What is the problem statement? And how exactly do you solve it? And he wants it to be very clear and very real, ideally with significant numbers of actual situations where someone has a problem and you've been able to solve it. That gets you to the third bullet of make sure you've got a clear definition of who your customer is and draw out some sort of a summary for me or an amalgamation of the folks you think are your target market. But as quickly as you can, stop telling me about some fictional character who has some problem you've defined and tell me about actual customers and their actual lives and their actual use of your product and how it helps them. Use quotes, be liberal with them, and make sure that you are able to prove to me before I'm going to invest with you that you've got someone for whom you are solving a problem and it matters to them. He continues with, you've got to show me how big you're able to get, and that's your growth rate, the size of your funnel and your sales pipeline, how you're moving people through the pipeline and where you lose potentials for sale, and how you intend to remediate against that. And of course, show me the math on how much money you're going to make, how many followers, how many fans, what's your conversion rate, how are you driving people toward the sales funnel, and how are you moving them through. And then get to some of the things we discussed on one of the prior slides. Show me the evidence that your team can execute on the business. Angels, he says, don't want to invest in development. They want to invest in reaching scale. It's John's assertion that having 10 or 15,000 customers, we were discussing an app maker, 10 or 15,000 customers for your app that runs on Android and iPhone and maybe Windows Phone or wherever else is about where an angel truly starts to get interested in a consumer application. Scale up or down accordingly for B2B applications or B2B solutions, whether they're product or service, but make sure before you look for investment that you've actually got. You'll get angels interested when you've actually proven that you've got a market. Before that, you're bootstrapping or your friends and family. And then pitch your vision and what you're going to do first to start realizing it. Tell me, he says, about your minimum viable product in your initial market and prove to me that it is a viable market. But then tell me about the second and third and fourth markets that you're going to get to from the first one. This is not a time, he points out, to be humble. It's a time to talk about how you're going to expand. Show me your go-to-market strategy. Show me how big you want your market to be. Show me the numbers. Show me the dollars. And then for those of you who are actually going to be pitching in pitch competitions, one piece of very concrete advice, this Regulation D506B from the Securities and Exchange Commission means that if you are in front of an audience that hasn't specifically asked to see you and you are not there specifically to make an ask for money, you can't ask for money. You have to be very careful about what you do and don't say, and that's where our friends at Early Growth Financial Services come in. Work with their CFOs to know in front of whom you can actually say, I'm looking for this size investment for this percentage of my company, and where you cannot say that. It's a little bit arcane. It's a little bit Talmudic, I guess, but there are clear rules on what you can say at a pitch competition versus what you can say when you're actually invited into a meeting with an angel or a VC. Let's move on. Now we get to what I think of as the fun part, because creating the story and putting together the deck, that's the behind-the-scenes work. That's the room in the with the whiteboard and the old pizza boxes and the sources of caffeine. But when you actually get up in front of the audience, that's where I like to help people just come alive and be their company's most exciting, most active proponent. I mentioned storytelling earlier. Every single time you are pitching your company, make sure you're ready to tell a story about it. Tell a story about its humble origin. Tell a story about your prospective customer or real customers that you have helped. Tell a story about being in a bake-off with a competitive solution and winning and why. Tell a story about someone you've helped because you've put a better product or service out there on the market. Emotion and that right brain want to get everything straight first and then fit the facts to what you're feeling. Engage both sides of people's brains. Make sure that you are raising a tear or getting a laugh or making someone feel empathetic to the characters in your story, or thinking to themselves, yeah, I've been in that position before, I can see how that would be. And then when you've got them bought into the narrative, bam, you can hit them between the eyes with the facts that make them say, oh, yes, that narrative must be so. I can see how that would come together.
I'm gonna jump in, Brian. Yeah, let me just jump in because we have a question here from Kishore, and I think this is something a lot of people wonder about. You know, storytelling is such a buzzword, but when you're saying create a story, is it like the opening is supposed to be a story, or you are weaving everything into a story, or you have a story about your competition, a story about your problem solution? Like, how in practicality, not theory, how does this concept of storytelling work?
That's an outstanding question, and I would say I've answered that question with different clients in different ways. What I find works well when you're not in a pitch competition is to weave a great narrative throughout an entire presentation. Not every point needs to be right on it, but you can begin a story, pick it up midstream later in a presentation, and then, bam, you've got a big conclusion at the end. I think pitch competitions and presentations for angels or VCs because they follow a script of their own, and there's certain bits of information you just need to get out, as we saw on the slide that had the two different configurations of proposed or desired sort of pitch flows, it's a little harder. So I like to start with some sort of a great story, some sort of an attention grabber, and I've got an example for you a little later in the presentation. If you begin with a company whose problems you've solved, if you're a business-to-business solution provider, or an individual whose life you've made better if you're a business-to-consumer solution provider, you can revisit that organization or that individual throughout your presentation, but usually you want to at least make sure that early on someone sees the problem you're solving in human terms before you go on to just the facts. We're going to have a market of this size, we're going to have this many people who show up at our front door, and this many of them are going to move through to engaging, and this many of them are going to move through to purchasing. So a couple of stories sprinkled throughout at appropriate places where you're talking about first making the case for the company and the problem that you solved being real, and then the way you solve it being sustainable. Great place for a story. Get in a little bit later to demonstrating in the pitch competition that you have really thought about your competition and who they are and what angle they come from and what they're leaving on the table and where you've got a hole in the market that you can fill. Another great place for a story. It could be aligned with the first one. Well, it should be aligned with the first one. It could even be a continuation of the first one, or it could be a wholly separate story about some competition you were in where you won. And then to close with a big finish, it's always nice to have another story in your back pocket or to somehow tie up some loose thread from your original story. I hope that answers the question. I realize it's a little wishy-washy. It really is just a function of what is your product and who's your listener in that particular, at that particular time. And if you're following a very strict rubric, or if you've got a little bit of, if you've got a few degrees of freedom.
Okay, great. And then, along this, I think that's really helpful because I think this concept of storytelling, we hear it all the time, but not everyone is a natural, quote unquote, storyteller, right? And so that takes us to another question, if you don't mind, from the audience.
Sure.
Okay, great. And then we can move on. But Marcus is saying you keep mentioning a talk track. And he's asking, is that the same thing as a script? Like, do you write down your story and memorize it? I mean, presumably you wouldn't recommend memorizing it, but for some people, they get really nervous. They're standing up there. So what do you say to that?
Beautiful. Good. Let me go back to the implied question that you began that with of, now wait a minute, it was in my head and then it flew out of my head. See, it happens to the best of us.
Not everyone's a natural storyteller, maybe, that people have some anxiety about this concept of being a storyteller. No?
Yeah, it'll come back to me. But
Okay.
so let's talk about the script itself, or the talk track. Here's how I like to work with my clients, and some of this is variable depending upon someone's natural skills and their natural level of nervousness. Some of it seems to fall along the fault line of technical founder versus marketing or business side founder. And I have worked with people of different roles differently. I don't like a script. I don't like a word-for-word script. It's too easy to get lost. It's too easy to get bogged down. It's too easy to have it sound like you're reading even when you are not. If it aids someone's comfort level when we're in rehearsal, when we're building the slides and talking about what points need to get made on each slide, we can write out a script of a couple of paragraphs per slide and have someone, if not quite fully memorize it, get fairly close, and then we start pulling the crutches away. What I've done with clients in the past is, if it's more comfortable for them to know exactly what they want to say, we write it out word for word. And at some point when they've got most of it down in their head, I take away everything except the first sentence of each paragraph and maybe add a couple of bullets that represent the content that was in the rest of the paragraph. And then they will use that first sentence more or less word for word, and they will have to create the bridge to the next paragraph themselves. You can see where this goes. Then you remove the bullets. Then you turn just the first paragraph into the first sentence of each paragraph into bullets. And eventually you get to a point where it's as if you didn't have a script in the first place because your own natural words come through. And we work on appropriate phrasing, certain pieces that you want to get in every time by building, say, a messaging framework. But a talk track is not a script. It's just a set of things that you want to get to on each slide. At most, someone might have an index card in their hand, if they've been working with me, that has a couple of bullet points per slide.
Okay, great. We have a few more questions here, but I'm going to let you move on. I think that's really helpful, and I know you still have a lot to cover. So
yeah, let's move on, and
yeah.
I'll attempt to pick up the pace a little. I'm trying to add some color and flavor to each slide, but I'll start moving a little quicker because I want to make the questions are what's most important because it's what's on your mind.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of pictures in order to tell a story. It is, in general, in public presentations, a mistake to have too many words on a slide. Again, pitch competitions and angels and VCs are one area where sometimes you can't avoid having a very crowded slide because you're trying to get a lot of information across. I do have an answer for that, and we'll get to it in a few moments. But I love that if you establish a picture with your 1,000 or hopefully a lot fewer words, you can repeat that picture over and over, and it will stand as a shorthand for your audience of everything you said the first time you showed it. You may have noticed on my agenda slide, I had a picture of the Big Mac, I had a picture of the PowerPoint logo, and I had a picture of a gentleman with his arm off to one side. You can see him from behind as if he's making a presentation. Each one of those pictures is reprised elsewhere in the deck so that it makes some sort of a cognitive connection for the audience of, now I understand where this guy is in his presentation. And again, every time, and this is almost too simple if you actually are at a pitch competition, bearing in mind that Securities and Exchange Commission ruling, tell me what you want. Make some sort of an ask. Too many people, and I see it with sales folks all the time, as you might imagine, you deliver a beautiful story, and then you get too shy to say, and will you please buy? So know what your ask is and know when you are supposed to make the financial ask, and when, as at a pitch competition, you're making an ask for something else. More registered users, or come see me after and let's set an appointment, or whatever that ask is. Call now, operators are standing by. Make an ask. Here's the fun part of having a grand opening, making sure that the audience is paying attention to you from the very beginning. Those of you who are of a certain age might remember this bit from the comedian Steve Martin. And if you don't know who the comedian Steve Martin is and you're just thinking of the film star Steve Martin, you're too young. But you may remember his bit of, you can be a millionaire and never pay taxes. You can have $1 million and never pay taxes. And you can see the rest here. And can any one of you, especially since we're talking about going out and seeking funding for your business, imagine not listening any further after someone says you can be a millionaire and never pay taxes? Now the payoff is in, you see I've got the click to play, so when you get the deck you'll be able to play this, but the bit continues with, how can I get $1 million and never pay taxes? Well, first get $1 million, and then he goes on to his method for avoiding paying taxes. I won't burden you with everything here, but you get the idea of ask a provocative question, raise some sort of a concern on the part of your audience, paint a rosy picture of a future that is better because of the product or service you're bringing to market, but get their attention from the start, and you'll have a way better chance of keeping them interested throughout. Here's our friend with the back of his head and that arm outstretched. When we're talking about getting in front of an audience, we're talking about appearing confident and in control. And there are a few ways to do that that signal you're in charge here. Keep your hands out of your pockets and stand up straight, right? I mean, it's simple. It's what your mom always told you to do when you were trying to hide during puberty. This point of willing hands, if you imagine you're not standing up now, you might want to stand up. Put your hands out at about sternum level with the palms up, and then drop them ever so slightly to around waist level. And that's a great neutral position to be in. The open hands actually signal to the audience your open-mindedness. They signal that you are approachable. And when you use your hands to gesture and point at the audience, they're picking up on these nonverbal cues that you are in control. I love to work with clients who can illustrate their points using their hands. Try and imagine, try and describe for yourself in your own mind for a moment what a spiral staircase or a compact fluorescent bulb looks like. And I defy you not to actually find yourself with your finger in front of your face twisting in the air. Just try and describe a spiral staircase without it. I like to work with my clients to find a couple of places in the presentation where they're actually painting a visual picture. It's not pantomime, but it is some sort of illustration, because as sure as I am talking to you now, you will have long forgotten my words when you still remember a picture or two in the presentation, or you remember a particular turn of phrase or a particular inflection that I'm using, or that I had you stand up and put your hands in front of your chest with the palms open. And of course, it should go without saying, but it doesn't. You're up there to make a human connection with the audience. Make sure you are looking out into the audience. Keep your eyes moving through the course of your presentation, keeping an eye out to the left and out to the right, in front of house and back of house, and make eye contact with one person in the audience and hold their gaze for a couple of seconds as you talk and make a point. And then move your head a little bit and look somewhere else. And I guarantee you 10 people sitting near that one person you think you've made eye contact with will think that you've made eye contact with them. Great way to keep people focused on you. The last tip here before we get to talking about the presentation deck itself is this weird study that it's a little hard to believe how pat it is, but last summer in the American Scholar magazine, an article from a noted linguist about playing a persona before you go out and do something difficult. Deciding that you're not Erica Malsberg, mild-mannered chief marketing officer, but you're Erica Malsberg, superhero, and before you go on stage, you talk to yourself using your own name and speaking in the third person instead of the first person. Now, we all think only sports stars do that when they're being interviewed post-game, and we think it's a little ridiculous. But believe it or not, when you're trying to psych yourself up, it's a great way to go to say, Brian is going to go out there and be great. He's going to rock it. He's going to have the audience eating out of the palm of his hand, and so on. Let's talk about the presentation deck itself. When I talked about you remembering the visuals more than my words, tell me you're going to forget how happy this guy looks. Tell me you're going to forget that he takes up half the page and he just dominates, and there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words on the entire slide. But you're going to remember that big, bold graphics is a great way to go. When you're talking about graphs and charts, don't make your audience do the work. Don't throw up a bunch of slides, a bunch of graphs that are undifferentiated. I could have pointed out, look at the bigger bar that's on the right. I could have pointed out, look at the fourth quarter numbers or whatever that's supposed to represent. But without you looking, without my verbal guidance, if all of these bars were the same color, you wouldn't be sure just what I was pointing out and where I wanted to draw your eye. As it is, I don't think I've left anything to doubt. I think you know where I'm trying to draw your eye. It's that one. I could have just as easily built a graph that pointed out that 1 quarter of very, very low sales there in the number 2 position. But no, in this case, I'm trying to get you there. Make it easy for your audience to know where you're trying to take them. And then involve and engage your audience. At a pitch competition, you've got enough time to be able to ask for a show of hands. Who's ever had a problem like this? And you name the problem that you're trying to solve. Tell me, would you spend X dollars for this? How about X plus 1? How about X plus 2? and get your audience engaged. It's one way, among other things, to keep them paying attention. When you're working a pitch competition and there's a lot of people in the room, I like to say go big or go home. You are, in some ways, an actor on stage. You want to gesticulate. You want to show with widespread arms that something is big, or with narrowed hands that something is small. You want to lean in on things. You want to be Aretha Franklin with that amazing hat that stole the day and got its own Twitter feed at the first Obama inaugural, right? You want to show I'm in control here. When you've got a stage or you've got the front of a room and you've got people to your left and to your right and in front of you, multiple rows of chairs, walk around a bit. Don't pace, but walk with purpose. Everything I said about making eye contact with one side of the room and then the other, make a point, pause for a moment, move a little, make a new eye contact, and then continue. It keeps people more interested in what you're doing. It keeps them focused on you. It keeps you from getting too nervous and tapping your feet, or I've got someone who calls it going on point, where you're bringing your toes to the ground and moving that leg back and forth. Build movement in. It humanizes you. It also allows you to move closer to people that you want to make particular points to, and keeps the audience engaged with you, because you can't move close to someone without their noticing that you're moving into their physical space and paying attention to you. I find this is particularly useful, and this goes back to when I used to teach third grade at the religious school at the synagogue my family belongs to. When you've got someone talking, or it's clear that they're more engrossed in their Twitter or their Facebook or their grocery list on their cell phone, just being a little bit closer to them actually helps them remember to pay attention to you. And then, much as I was just saying, the old game from preschool and kindergarten, 1, 2, 3 grades is easy. A teacher says 1, 2, 3 eyes on me. The kids say 1, 2 eyes on you. There's a bunch of things. You don't want to do that with an audience of grown-ups, but there are things you can do to keep attention on yourself. From raising your voice at certain points, to whispering conspiratorially to make a key point. And as humans, we're trained to pay attention when someone shouts or someone whispers, all the way through to the simple and even silly of you make a point, you finish it, before you move from stage left to stage right or stage right to stage left, you clap your hands and say something like, all right, let's move on. Any one of those things interrupts someone else's thought pattern just enough that they want to pay attention for a moment, and you can get your audience to stay with you. When you're past the pitch competition and you're actually meeting with an angel or a VC and you have a small room to work, that's the point at which you may bring your 15 slides, and they may let you go through all of them. They may want you to, but given the opportunity, it's yours to turn it into a conversation, not just a presentation. I've seen this go both ways, where they want you to be very scripted and you just get through your presentation, and they're going to see 3 of them that day, and they just want you in and then out, and they'll talk to you later. But I've also seen the hour-long meeting turn into the 3-hour meeting because there's so many questions and you still don't get through all of your slides. Be prepared to ask your audience questions if you've got things you think they can help you with. It goes back to the prior point of, sure, you're looking for their investment, but you're also looking for their emotional as well as financial investment. You're looking for the right partner who can prove to you that they've got the wisdom, the experience in your market, the connections that can help you be successful, and engaging in that way is great. A leftover from my Microsoft days is this expression of welcome to math camp. The story is told of Bill Gates or Steve Ballmer short-circuiting someone who's up presenting in front of them about some direction the company should take, and saying, now I'm in the appendix and I'm on slide number 32. and I see that you've got a spreadsheet there, and in cell AB 364, you've got the number 37 million. Can you tell me how you arrived at that 37 million? And you know, and I know, they don't care exactly how you got to that 37 million. They're not trying to take a number that's on a pro forma spreadsheet and have you prove that it is exactly right. But they are looking for some validation that you understand what's going on and what assumptions you have made and what the various inputs and variables are, and that you can articulate what really is going on in cell AB 364 on page 32. Because if you can do that, they know you've done your homework. And maybe because most of the work I do with startups is here in Seattle, there's a lot of ex-Microsofties who fancy themselves as capable of taking someone to math camp. And we work very hard to make sure that our presenters are ready, or in some cases they've got the right people with them to say, oh, David will know the answer to that. David, can you come up and give us a couple of minutes of your time? So be ready. It goes to, and if you're founders and you're off doing these presentations, chances are you do know how this is done, and you can explain what's going on in cell AB 364, but just double check and have your team ask you tough questions well in advance of the time you ever get in front of an actual source, a potential source of funding. And I love this question. When you are working a small room, it goes back to the point we've now made a couple of times about looking for someone who can be a true partner to you instead of just a source of funding. If you get asked a tough question, great way to answer it is, you know, we've thought about that a lot, and our preliminary thinking is this, but I'd be interested in your perspective, since you've seen a lot of companies like ours. How might we go about solving that problem? Or is that the kind of problem you could help us solve? And there's certain things you're going to be expected to do on your own, of course, but the opportunity to use the wisdom that's in the room from people who have invested in bunches of companies and have presumably had some number of hits and seen a greater number of failures, great advice to get. Flatter them by asking for their opinion as well. You can see here an example of a page that I've created. I like working with many of my clients to create two versions of the presentation deck. One that would have just everything that's to the left outside of that gray box, and the other that has that stuff smushed over toward the left and the gray box on the right. One deck for presentation purposes, another deck for send ahead or leave behind purposes. And the points I'm making here, for a pitch competition, when you've got Q&A, my quick primer on how to handle questions and answers in a public forum: look the questioner in the eye, thank them for their question, spend 10 or 15 seconds, couple of sentences, directly answering their question, and then move your gaze away from them so it doesn't become a dialogue between you and the questioner, and you keep the rest of the audience engaged. Go back to presentation mode. Go back to moving a little bit in front of the room. Go back to making eye contact around the room. And when you can, unless this is a particular question that you are just dying to answer, make sure you get back to some of your key principles and you make the point you want to make with the answer. Because a static answer to one person's question is often just that. It's an answer to one person's question. If you can broaden the question and say, now I'll bet other people here are thinking about X, or as I said before, and you reiterate a couple of key points, that's effective question and answer sessions during a pitch competition or during any public presentation. For the small room presentation, the tip really is the slide. Feel free to have two different versions that are exactly alike in every way, except on one you steal some real estate to the right, left, bottom, to put in the key points that you want to make on the slide. This is a great way, back to the earlier questioner, for a presenter to get more comfortable with the content that he or she wants to cover on each slide. If you present for a period of time using the send ahead or leave behind deck, instead of the deck that you're actually going to use on screen when you're in front of a group. Lots more
Brian,
help on the early growth.
I'm sorry. Can I jump in on that past slide? Because we have a couple of questions here from folks that I think are relevant to this slide about
Absolutely.
Okay, great. About versioning, basically. So we have two questions. So first we have Martin, who's logged in here from Nairobi, which is very nice to have
Hello,
him.
Martin.
And he's asking, a lot of what we're talking about today is doing your full-on pitch, right? But he's saying, how do you pitch the same story in 3 minutes, in 7 minutes, in 20 minutes? Like, do you have different versions? Do you create different versions? Do you excerpt? What's your strategy for that?
Love it. Martin, thank you for the question. One of the first things that I'll do with a new client is, before we get to building slides, before we get to knowing that we're going to have slides numbered 1 through 14 or 1 through 12 or whatever the rubric calls for, is we talk about what's your message. And I use a very standard format template for a messaging framework. A messaging framework done right gives you your elevator pitch version of your presentation. 2, 3, 4 sentences, right? Your sort of value proposition, the elevator pitch that explains what you do, for whom, why, what it does for them, and what's your secret sauce that gives you some competitive advantage. And then goes on to look audience by audience at what are the key themes you want to hit, and then gets even more detailed than that. For each of the key themes or pillars of your story, what are the stories you tell that demonstrate that it's true, and what are the key benefits that you claim? So imagine it as a spreadsheet with a couple of long lines across the top, and then you can divide the width of those long lines into thirds, and you've got your 3 pillars for your story. And within, underneath in each of those 3 pillars, you've got the key points you want to make, and you've got the stories that illustrate them. And by the time you've done that, you've got your 50-word version, you've got your 200-word version, you've got your 500-word version, and you've got the full PowerPoint deck version, and you can build them out. Some clients work with me just to develop the messaging framework, and they're off to the races, and everything that we've done that says this is your core messaging ripples through to their website content, the success stories that they research, write, and distribute, the collateral material that their salespeople use, and yes, the pitch deck that they have. So it sounds like a lot of work up front, and frankly it is, but once you've gone through the process of building the short version of the story to the long version of the story, you can fit any length conversation you wish.
Great, thank you, Brian. And then we have
I hope that helped. Sure.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And then we have a couple of questions that I think are actually related, so I'm going to try and draw a connection here. So, and building off of Martin's question as well. So first we have Anne, who says, great timing attending today's webinar because she has an angel pitch next Friday. And she's so hopefully this is helpful. So she's saying their format's old school, no slides, but the ability to hit the salient points in 5 to 10 minutes and then end with an ask, including terms if possible. And then you'll only send the slides to the interested party. And now, if you allow me to make a sort of a leap here, we have another question from Diana, who's interested in graphics, and she's just saying she wanted more info on that. And I was thinking it's kind of an interesting connection between those two questions, because by choosing such bold graphics as you're recommending, it's almost like they take the place of your words in many points. So how do you I guess I have 2 questions here off of theirs. Like, one is, how are you building your words with your graphics? Do you do the graphics first and then sort of build the words out of that? What's the relationship between them? And if you can't use graphics, can you still tell your story if you've constructed around these big, bold graphics? If that makes sense, that I made that connection there.
It does make sense, and thank you, Anne, and thank you, Diana, for the question. So Anne, let's go back and consider that prior point of, given that you don't want to memorize a script, because I vehemently believe memorization just leads you down a bad path where if you forget one word or one line, you're flustered and you just can't go on easily, and it shows. you need to be able to create in your mind or follow a deck that you're just not showing of these key 13 or 14 things that you know any investor should want to hear. Go back to the slide with just the simple 3 items on it: market risk, product risk, execution risk, and try to address each of those and make sure that everybody understands where your product's going to go, what size your market is, how you're going to attract and win customers, how you're going to retain them, and so on. I think if you take a paragraph or 2 for each of those chunks of information that you know an audience is going to want to hear when it's a pitch competition, because there's only so many things they're going to want to hear about, build your paragraph or 2, and then go about the business of memorizing the general flow and knowing what key points you want to make without actually memorizing your script. Given that you will have a deck that you send only to interested parties, someone who's looking at that deck should, A, be able to look at the deck and call back to mind what you said during the pitch that went on without slides, and B, should be able to have your sort of visual cues or your verbal cues written in there, much the way I've done on this slide number 28 here. So knowing that you're not just actually going to present, even if you're using big, bold graphics, make sure your couple of key bullets for each slide appear down that right side. Erica, help me out with Diana's question was
well, she wanted to know more about
the graphics, or are you building the words first?
Well, I think she just wants to know more about graphics in general. So one question I think is interesting is that, are you sort of creating your narrative and then finding images to fill that, or I'm not quite sure. And also, if you have just any practical resources for graphics where you like to source them, I think that'd be useful too.
So, good stuff. I don't, the way I will work with clients, the words and the graphics sort of come together. I like to ask a lot of questions very early. What are you trying to say here? How are you actually attracting your customers? How are you turning prospects into customers? What market have you gone after and why? And through that verbalization and forcing folks to really put into words what they sort of innately know in their heads, images tend to, at least in my world, they tend to begin to suggest themselves. Anybody who's at the point where they're readying for an investor pitch, whether it's a pitch competition or whether it's actually getting in front of angels or VCs, has been selling their product for a while or readying themselves to do so, and chances are they've got something built. Right? I'm not working with, a startup is putting that stuff together on their own. They're not using someone like me. So by the time you're ready to get into a pitch competition, you've got certain graphics and a certain branded look and feel to your company that you should be borrowing. So it's kind of, you have to have the concepts down. Fitting the exact words and the exact pictures tends to happen in parallel, and sometimes one leads the other, and sometimes the other leads the one. For sources for material, I'll have to send it to you, Erica, for distribution to the folks that are online today. At one point, I came upon a web source, a web article with like 53 great sources for free presentation graphics. And some of them are free for the first 10 that you want to download, and some of them are free if you register with the site and so on. But there are plenty of sites out there that have either material that belongs in the Creative Commons, where folks have made free graphics, free high-res graphics available, and there are plenty of other sites that have their own proprietary stuff that offer some of it available for free. One of my favorite websites to go to for good suggestions on how to build a deck is Speaking PowerPoint. I think it's actually speakingppt.com. A fellow named Bruce Gabriel, who I think is a genius, is just marvelous at working out storytelling through presentation graphics, and I have borrowed many a hint from him. And last, it's surprisingly inexpensive these days. There's lots of photographers out there who are looking for work. It's surprisingly inexpensive to stage your own photo shoot. It's actually harder, I find, often to get the people who will stand in for a client sitting around the table for you than it is to get a photographer who will spend an inexpensive half day or a day with you.
Great, thank you. And I know we're at the hour here, and we have one more question I'd like to get to, but why don't you, if you could just kind of quickly flip the deck past so you can show
Yeah.
people what they'll be getting.
Yeah, when you do get the deck, you'll see all of these links just from Early Growth Financial Services. Heaven knows if you're really thinking about this, you've probably already spent some time on your favorite web search, to your favorite web engine to find material. Here's some useful stuff just from our friends at Early Growth. And then the last bit is, I hope that many of you will take the opportunity to connect with me either just by connecting on LinkedIn or following my Twitter feed for presentations and presenters, or there's my email, there's my phone. And if you wait until about the 1st of July, the website at www.3ccoms.com will be live, and you'll be one of the first people able to visit. So thank you very much for your time and interest. I hope this has been useful, and I'm happy to stay on the line for a little bit longer if anybody else can stay to answer a few more of the questions from Erica.
Thanks so much. You know what, I know that people have to drop off, so I'm going to do our little close. And if you don't mind, I have one question that I'm going to get to after the little close here.
The big finish,
then,
sure.
yeah. So, but for those of you who have to drop off, I want to be mindful of your time, and I respect that you've taken an hour to sit with us, and we hope that you found it to be a good use of time. If you have follow-up questions you didn't get a chance to ask, you see Brian's contact information here, so feel free to reach out to him. You can also tweet us again at Early Growth FS with the hashtag Startup Pitch, and we'd be happy to answer your questions there. We have another webinar coming up tomorrow on June 24th, and that's going to be creating a chart of accounts for your startup, and that's with Ryan Johnson, who's our VP of Operations here at Early Growth. So it's a far cry from pitch decks, but just as useful for your business and the health of your business. So if that sounds of interest to you, you can go to our events page to register for this event, and also check out the other events we have coming up. So Brian, before I thank you profusely and let you go, I just wanted to get to this one last question that I think is an interesting close, and it's from Karash. I'm not sure I'm saying your name right, Karash, sorry. But he's saying he's pitched angels that have criticized too many icons or pitch decks that have been watered down, and it's insulting. And he's asking, what's the perfect balance, and how do you know you've achieved that?
Give that to me when we're too many icons and
Yeah, so I think that he's saying there's too many icons, and that the pitch deck's been watered down. So I think that what he's saying here is that, I mean, and maybe the question of not choosing the right graphics, but it sounds like the graphics that are being chosen are detracting from the actual message that the pitch deck is supposed to be delivering. And so he's wondering how you rectify that. You know, on the one hand, big, bold graphics to get people's attention. On the other hand, where's the meat, you know?
Okay. Yeah, I think, and what I have presented you with here is not, of course, a pitch deck. It's a deck about how to go out and pitch. And as a result, yes, the big, bold graphics are great. I like, where possible, on those slides that are prescriptive when you're building a pitch deck. Go back to that one slide that had the 14 items on the left and the 12 items on the right. Some of those slides are just plain going to need to be dense. They're going to need to show several years of pro forma results, or a chart that goes on from the entire, from the left side of the page to the right side of the page. You're going to have to include some quotes that are from your actual users or your site visitors or whatever it is you've got, and that's probably going to take up some space. There's just no getting around, when you're dealing with financial information and demonstrating results or getting into patent information about some way you've got of protecting your intellectual property. Some of them are going to be dense, and I don't know a way around that. But for the slides that actually build the story, this is Emily. Emily's got this particular problem. You know people like Emily. Here's how we solve her problem. Just that picture of Emily, who's the 30-something mom with 2 kids and a spouse and a job, and she commutes to work, and oh man, there's all that stress. If you're offering stress relief, you just need a picture of one person looking harried and scary. As for what's the perfect balance, yeah, good luck with that. I honestly, I've seen the same slide deck be lauded to the heavens by one group, and days later been told, I'm sorry, there's nowhere near enough information, and I can't figure out your company based on this information. I counsel my clients to be true to themselves and to go out and test drive things, but there is no such thing as making all of the people happy all of the time. If it turns out that someone gives you feedback on your pitch deck that it's just not getting them where they need to be to feel like they're investing, it's a good sign there's not a match, so long as you're getting equal feedback from the other side. If everyone's telling you the same thing, then maybe you've got a problem. It's time to engage a professional. Or
Yeah.
to go back to one of the people who said not enough here, and hit them with that question I raised earlier. How might we make this more engaging, and how might we make this more successful, and see if you can't get someone to spend a few minutes with you to help you out.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Thank you, Brian. And if you have follow-up questions or want to, specifically ask Brian to work with you on your presentation, then I encourage you to reach out to him, and maybe he can help you to find that perfect balance. So on that note, thank you again so much for your time. I thought this was incredibly useful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. Please feel free to reach out to Brian and follow up, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.